The whole pack had gathered for the ceremony, and Wren had never felt so many eyes on her in her entire life. She stood at the altar in a white dress that itched at the collar, hands clasped in front of her so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Beside her, Callum looked exactly like he always did, tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, the kind of alpha every pack member respected without question. She'd loved him since she was 14. She'd waited 3 years for this exact moment, standing under the flowering arch their pack elder had built by hand, waiting for him to say the words that would bind them together forever. He wasn't looking at her. She noticed it first in the way his jaw kept tightening, the way his eyes kept sliding toward the crowd instead of staying on her face where they belonged. The pack elder cleared his throat, gesturing for Callum to begin the vows, and there was a pause, just a beat too long, the kind of silence that makes a room hold its breath. "Callum?" Wren whispered. He turned to her then, and whatever was in his eyes wasn't love. It wasn't even regret, not really. It was something closer to relief, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying too long. "I can't do this," he said. The words landed in the open air between them, loud enough that the front 3 rows heard it clearly, and Wren watched the ripple of shock move backward through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. "What?" she managed. "I found her," Callum said. "My actual mate. 2 weeks ago, at the trade summit. I felt it the moment I saw her, Wren, and I've been trying to figure out how to tell you, and I can't marry you knowing what I know now. You felt the bond. With someone else. Yes, 2 weeks ago. Yes, and you decided to tell me here?" Wren said, her voice cracking on the word, in front of the entire pack, instead of literally any other moment in the last 14 days? Callum had the decency to look ashamed, at least, though shame didn't undo anything. "I kept hoping I was wrong. I wanted to be sure before I hurt you." "You're not hurting me now," Wren said. "You're humiliating me." She heard the murmurs start pity in some voices, cruel amusement in others, the particular ugly delight some people take in watching someone else's worst moment happen in public. Someone near the back actually laughed, quickly muffled, and Wren felt her face go hot with a shame that had nothing to do with anything she'd actually done. "I reject you," Callum said, and his voice had gone formal now, ceremonial, the exact opposite of how it should have sounded. "As my intended mate. I release you from any claim between us." The words hit her like a physical blow, and for one terrible moment, Wren thought her legs might actually give out beneath her. A rejection wasn't like a broken engagement among humans, it was a formal severing of something that had already half-formed between them, something that would leave a mark whether she wanted it to or not. "Fine," she said, because it was the only word she could find, and it came out steadier than she felt. "I accept your rejection." She didn't wait for his reaction. She turned, walked back down the aisle in her itchy white dress, past every staring face in the pack she'd grown up in, and didn't stop walking until she was well outside the ceremony hall, gasping in air that tasted like humiliation. She didn't notice, in her rush to escape, the man standing at the very back of the crowd who hadn't laughed, hadn't murmured, hadn't looked away from her once during the entire scene, a stranger in dark traveling clothes, watching with an intensity that would have unsettled her if she'd had the presence of mind to notice it at all. Wren made it 3 streets from the ceremony hall before she stopped walking entirely, pressed her back against a stone wall, and let herself finally cry. It wasn't graceful crying. It was the ugly kind, the kind that came in gasping heaves, 3 years of hope and plans and quiet certainty collapsing all at once into something that felt like grief for a person who hadn't even died. She'd built her whole future around Callum. She'd imagined their pups, their den, the particular shape their life together would take. And in the space of 30 seconds, all of it had been rewritten into a story where she was simply the girl who got left at the altar in front of everyone she'd ever known. "That was cruel," a voice said. What he did to you. Ren's head snapped up. The man from the back of the crowd stood a few feet away, close enough to have spoken but not so close as to feel threatening. He was taller than Callum, even with dark hair pushed back from a face that held none of the smug pity she'd been bracing for. "Who are you?" she said, wiping her face roughly with the back of her hand, embarrassed to be caught mid-collapse by a stranger. No one important. "I was passing through for the trade summit and stayed an extra day to see the ceremony." He paused. "I regret staying. Now, I didn't expect to watch a man do that to someone in front of an entire pack." "You watched the whole thing." "I did." "Great," Ren said, laughing without any humor in it at all. "So you got a front row seat to the worst moment of my life." "Lovely. Thank you for that." "I'm not laughing at you," he said, and something in his voice made her actually look at him properly for the first time. His eyes were dark, steady, entirely without the mockery she expected. For what it's worth, the fault in that room belonged entirely to him. Not you. Ren studied him for a long moment, trying to place him among the faces she'd have expected at a trade summit merchants, minor pack officials. The occasional wandering trader looking to make deals with the local Alpha's council. He didn't fit any of those categories cleanly. There was something in the way he stood, feet planted, shoulders set, that suggested a man used to being obeyed rather than one used to negotiating. "You still haven't told me who you are," she said. "Does it matter right now?" "I just watched my entire future collapse in front of everyone I've ever known," Ren said. "I think I'm allowed a little curiosity as a distraction." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Fair enough. My name is Thorn. Just Thorn. For now." It should have bothered her, the deliberate vagueness of it, but she was too wrung out to push further. "Well, Thorn, thank you for the kind words, but I should probably go find somewhere private to fall apart properly instead of doing it against a wall in the middle of the street. Do you have somewhere to go?" The question caught her off guard, mostly because the honest answer was more complicated than she wanted to admit to a stranger. Her family home had been given up when she'd moved into pack housing in anticipation of marrying Callum. Her belongings were, even now, half packed into his den. She had, in the space of one ceremony, become someone with no clear home at all. "I'll figure something out," she said, which wasn't an answer, and they both knew it. Thorn studied her for a long moment, something calculating and careful moving behind his eyes. "There's an inn 2 streets over. Decent, quiet. I'll cover the cost of a room for tonight at least, so you have somewhere to think without an audience. I don't need charity from a stranger. It's not charity," he said. "Call it decency. I don't think anyone in that hall today showed you much of it, and someone should." She wanted to refuse on principle, but principle was a luxury she wasn't sure she could afford at the moment, standing in a torn hem of a wedding dress with nowhere else to sleep. "Fine," she said finally. "One night. And I'll pay you back eventually, even if it takes a while. You don't have to." "I want to," Ren said. "I don't like owing people things I can't repay." Something in his expression shifted at that approval, maybe, or something adjacent to it, and he nodded once, like the terms had been settled to his satisfaction. The inn was exactly as he'd described, small, clean, quiet in the particular way that suggested most of its guests were passing through, rather than staying long. Ren sat on the edge of the narrow bed once she was alone, still in her ruined wedding dress, and stared at the wall for a long time without actually seeing it. She kept replaying the moment Callum's face, the relief in it, the way he'd said I found her like Ren had simply been a placeholder all along, a warm body to occupy the space until the real thing arrived. 3 years. She'd given him 3 years of her life, had turned down other offers, other possibilities, because she'd believed with absolute certainty that they were building something permanent. There was a knock at the door. Sometime later, she'd lost track of exactly how long she'd been sitting there, and when she opened it, a young serving girl stood there with a tray. "The gentleman downstairs asked me to bring this up," the girl said. "Said you probably hadn't eaten." Wren hadn't in fact eaten anything since the morning, too nervous about the ceremony to manage more than a few bites of bread. She accepted the tray with a quiet thank you and closed the door, and found herself, despite everything, genuinely touched by the gesture. A stranger who'd witnessed her public humiliation had thought to make sure she ate. It was such a small thing, and yet it was more consideration than Callum had shown her in the final 2 weeks of their entire relationship. She ate slowly, methodically, and by the time she finished, some of the raw edge of the day's grief had dulled into something more manageable, not healed. Not close to it, but survivable. The next morning, she went looking for Thorn to thank him properly, and found the inn's common room instead full of hushed, urgent conversation among the staff, all of it centered around something that had apparently happened overnight. Can't believe he was here the whole time. Right under everyone's noses, the Alpha King himself, traveling without his usual guard. No wonder no one recognized him. Wren's stomach dropped somewhere below the floorboards. She found the innkeeper directly, gripping the edge of his counter with white knuckles. "The man who paid for my room last night," she said. "Thorn, who is he actually?" The innkeeper blinked at her like she'd asked something obviously absurd. "You don't know?" That was Alpha King Merrick, ruler of the Northern Territories. He's been traveling incognito for the trade summit, apparently prefers to see how his neighboring packs actually operate without the pageantry that comes with announcing himself. "The Alpha King," Wren repeated slowly. "The very one," the innkeeper said. Quite the mystery, having him stay under a false name in a place like this. Most kings wouldn't be caught within a mile of an inn this modest. Wren sat down hard on the nearest bench, trying to reconcile the quiet, careful stranger who'd offered her a room, and sent up food with the image she'd always had of Alpha King's distant, untouchable figures, who existed on a plane entirely separate from ordinary pack members like her. She found him an hour later in the small courtyard behind the inn, and this time she didn't bother with pleasantries. "You're the Alpha King," she said, "of the Northern Territories." He didn't look surprised that she'd found out. If anything, there was something almost relieved in his expression, like he'd been waiting for the moment the pretense would drop. "I am. You let me think you were just some traveler. You paid for my room, sent up food, sat with me while I fell apart, and never once mentioned you were a king. Would it have changed anything if I had?" "It would have changed how I acted," Wren said. "I wouldn't have accepted charity so easily from an actual king. I would have, I don't know. Been more careful, more formal. That's exactly why I didn't tell you," Thorn Merrick said simply. "You needed someone to be kind to you yesterday, not someone to perform careful formality around. I wasn't interested in being treated like a title. I wanted to actually help." Wren studied him, searching for the deception she felt certain must be hiding somewhere in his explanation, and found, disconcertingly, that she believed him entirely. "Why did you stay to watch the ceremony at all?" she asked instead. "You're a king. Surely you have better things to do than watch a minor pack wedding." Something in his expression shifted, careful and considering. "I stay for most ceremonies during summit season. It's useful. Watching how packs conduct their traditions, it tells you things about their leadership that formal negotiations never do." He paused. "But if I'm being honest, I stayed for yours specifically because something about you caught my attention the moment you walked down that aisle. I couldn't have told you why. Exactly, until he rejected you and I felt something in my own chest that had no business being there." Wren's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I think you know what I mean," Merrick said quietly. "I think you felt something similar, if you're being honest with yourself, when I first spoke to you against that wall yesterday." She had, If she let herself admit it, some warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the grief still raw beneath it, some strange pull she'd dismissed as shock or exhaustion at the time. "That's not possible," she said. "I was rejected yesterday." "Formally, my bond with Callum, your bond with Callum, was never a true mate bond," Merrick said. "If it had been, he couldn't have felt one forming with someone else. True bonds don't split that easily, not in 2 weeks, not for anyone. Whatever the two of you shared, it was affection, maybe even love in its own way, but it wasn't the bond he claimed to reject at that altar." "How do you know that?" "Because I've felt an actual one starting," Merrick said, "since the moment you walked past me yesterday. I recognized the sensation immediately, and I spent the entire ceremony trying to convince myself I was wrong, because the timing was catastrophic and I had no intention of complicating an already devastating day for you." Ren stared at him, heart hammering, trying to process the sheer scale of what he was suggesting. "You think we're mates?" "I think it's possible," he said carefully. "I won't claim certainty, but I'd like the chance to find out, if you're willing, once you've had time to actually grieve what happened yesterday properly, instead of leaping into something new out of desperation." Ren didn't answer him immediately. She couldn't. Everything in her wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, rejected by one alpha in the morning, propositioned by an alpha king by evening. The sheer speed of the emotional whiplash, almost comedic if it hadn't been happening to her own life. "I need time," she said finally. "I can't, Merrick. I can't even process what happened yesterday, let alone consider whatever this is. I need to actually grieve, like you said. I need to figure out what my life even looks like now. Without a pack den waiting for me, without a mate, without any of the plans I'd built around Callum." "That's fair," he said, and there was no impatience in it, no pressure, just quiet acceptance. "Take whatever time you need. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. Then why tell me at all? Why not wait until I'd had that time before saying anything?" "Because I think you deserve to know the truth about what happened yesterday," Marek said. "That the rejection you felt wasn't the end of some grand cosmic connection. It was a man choosing someone else over affection. That, while real, was never the deepest thing either of you were capable of feeling. I didn't want you carrying around the belief that you'd lost something more profound than what actually happened." It was, strangely, exactly the right thing to say, and Ren felt something in her chest loosen, slightly not healed, not close to it, but less crushingly final than it had felt an hour before. "I'm going back to my family's old village," she said. "For a while, at least. I need somewhere familiar, somewhere that isn't full of people who watched me get left at that altar. Would you allow me to send word occasionally? Nothing demanding, just to check that you're well." She considered it, weighing the strangeness of the request against the genuine warmth she'd felt from him since the very first moment. "Fine," she said. Occasionally, he nodded, and there was something in his expression, relief, restrained but real, that told her the answer had mattered more to him than he'd let on. Ren left the inn that afternoon and traveled the 2 days back to her childhood village, a small settlement 3 valleys over from the pack she'd grown up in, where an aunt still kept the old family cottage and welcomed her without a single question about why she'd arrived alone, in travel-worn clothes, with none of her belongings from the den she'd been meant to share. "You'll tell me, when you're ready," her aunt said simply, setting a bowl of stew in front of her the first evening. Not before. It took nearly 2 weeks before Ren told her anything at all, and even then, the story came out in fragments: the ceremony, the rejection, the humiliation of an entire pack watching her walk back down that aisle alone. Her aunt listened without judgment, without the particular pitying sympathy Ren had been dreading, and simply held her when the telling of it made her cry again. "And the king?" her aunt asked, once the story had wound its way to its actual ending. "You mentioned him almost as an afterthought, but I don't think he was one. I don't know what to think about him," Ren admitted. "It's too fast. Too strange. A king showing interest in someone who was left at the altar by another man not even a full day earlier. It doesn't make sense to trust it. Or, her aunt said, it's simply a man who recognized something worth paying attention to and had the decency to wait rather than push. The first letter arrived 9 days after Wren left the inn, simple, unadorned, asking only how she was managing and mentioning, briefly, a minor dispute he'd resolved between 2 trading villages that week. Nothing demanding, nothing pressuring, exactly as he'd promised. She hadn't intended to reply. But somehow, 3 days later, she found herself sitting at her aunt's kitchen table with a pen in hand, writing back anyway. The letters became a habit before Wren had quite decided to let them. At first, they were brief, a few lines about the weather, about small village happenings, careful and impersonal in the way 2 strangers testing unfamiliar ground tend to be. But something in Merrick's writing style disarmed her slowly, week by week. He wasn't performing kingliness in his letters. He complained about council meetings that ran too long, admitted to being genuinely bad at remembering names during formal introductions, once described an entire page's worth of frustration over a bureaucrat who kept misfiling trade documents. He wrote like an actual person, not like a title. I found myself explaining to my council today why I've been corresponding with someone from the southern valleys, he wrote, 6 weeks into the exchange. I didn't have a particularly good answer beyond the truth, which is that I simply enjoy hearing about your days more than I enjoy most of what fills mine. Wren read that particular letter 3 times before setting it down, something warm and unfamiliar unfurling in her chest that she wasn't entirely ready to name. My aunt asked about you again, she wrote back. I told her you complain about paperwork more than most kings probably should admit to in writing. She said that's a good sign. Apparently the ones who pretend everything is effortless are the ones worth worrying about. Your aunt sounds like a wise woman, he wrote back. Tell her I'll try to maintain my reputation for appropriate levels of complaining. It was during the 3rd month of letters that Wren realized, with a startling clarity, that she was happier reading his handwriting than she'd been in most of her 3 years with Callum. There was no performance in it, no careful management of expectations, just 2 people slowly becoming familiar with each other's actual minds rather than the roles they were supposed to occupy. She mentioned this, eventually, to her aunt, who simply raised an eyebrow and said, "And you're surprised by this?" "I don't know what I am," Wren admitted. "Confused, maybe. It feels too easy. After everything with Callum felt so complicated in the end. I keep waiting for some catch." Or, her aunt said, "You've simply never experienced what it feels like to matter to someone without having to work for it. Some things aren't supposed to feel complicated. Wren, some things are simply good, and the difficulty is trusting that they can be." The letter that arrived at the start of the 4th month was different from the others, longer, more careful in its phrasing. And it took Wren several readings before she fully understood what he was actually asking. "I don't want to rush what's happening between us," he wrote, "but I find I've reached the limit of what I can properly express through letters, and I'd like the chance to see you again in person, without the ceremony that surrounded our first meeting. Without the shadow of what happened to you that day hanging over everything. If you're willing, I'd like to visit the southern valleys myself, rather than asking you to travel to me. I think you deserve to be met on your own ground, for once, instead of always having to adjust yourself to someone else's territory." Wren sat with the letter for a long time before showing it to her aunt, who read it once and immediately began fussing about which room in the cottage would be appropriate for hosting an Alpha King, an entirely practical concern that made Wren laugh despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "You don't have to decide anything by seeing him again," her aunt said, more gently. "You're allowed to simply see, and figure out the rest as it comes." Wren wrote back her acceptance that same evening, and spent the following 2 weeks in a state of nervous anticipation she hadn't experienced since the early days with Callum, except this time, underneath the nerves, There was none of the anxious uncertainty that had always lingered at the edges of her first relationship. Just a kind of hopeful curiosity about what might actually be waiting for her. Merrick arrived on a bright, clear morning nearly 4 months after the ceremony that had shattered her old life, and Wren found herself standing at her aunt's garden gate watching a modest, unmarked carriage approach with her heart hammering harder than she wanted to admit. He stepped out looking exactly as she remembered, tall, dark-haired, that same careful steadiness in the way he held himself, but there was something different in his expression this time. Something more open, less guarded than the man who'd introduced himself as simply Thorne outside a ceremony hall months earlier. "You came," Wren said, immediately feeling foolish for stating the obvious. "I said I would." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze made her chest tighten pleasantly. "You look well. Better than the last time I saw you, at least." "I feel better," she admitted. "Time helped. And your letters, if I'm being honest." "Good," he said simply, and the warmth in the single word settled something nervous in her stomach. Her aunt insisted on feeding him almost immediately, an act of hospitality that seemed to delight rather than embarrass him, and Wren watched with quiet amusement as the Alpha King of the Northern Territories sat at her aunt's worn kitchen table, eating stew from a chipped bowl, answering her aunt's blunt questions about his intentions with more patience than most nobles would have managed. "And if this doesn't work out," her aunt said at one point, entirely without preamble, "what happens to my niece? She's already been humiliated once by a man who couldn't keep his commitments straight. I won't watch her go through that twice." "If it doesn't work out," Marek said, meeting her aunt's sharp gaze without flinching, "it will be because we discovered we're not suited for each other. Not because I abandoned her carelessly or treated her feelings as disposable. I can't promise certainty about how any of this ends. I can promise I won't treat her the way Callum did." Her aunt studied him for a long moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied, and changed the subject to whether he'd like more bread. Later, walking through the small orchard behind the cottage as evening settled in, Wren finally asked the question she'd been circling since his arrival. "Do you still think it's a true bond between us? It's been 4 months. You could have felt it fade, or realized you were wrong." "I haven't felt it fade," Merrick said. "If anything, it's grown stronger with every letter. Every week that passed. I feel it now, standing here with you, clearer than I did that first day outside the ceremony hall." "I feel something too," Wren admitted quietly. "I don't know if I trust it entirely yet. Not because of you specifically, just because the last time I trusted a bond completely, it turned out to be less than I believed." "That's fair," he said. "I don't need you to trust it completely today. I only need you willing to keep discovering it with me, at whatever pace feels safe." They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, and Wren found herself, for the first time since the ceremony, imagining an actual future again, not with the desperate certainty she'd once had about Callum, but with something quieter and more honest, built on months of careful letters and small truths rather than 3 years of assumptions she'd never properly examined. "I'd like you to stay a few days," she said eventually, "not to decide anything, just to see what it's like, having you actually present instead of just words on a page. I'd like that too," Merrick said, and something in his voice suggested he'd been hoping for exactly this invitation since he'd stepped out of the carriage that morning. The days that followed passed in a way Wren hadn't expected, unhurried, comfortable, full of small moments that felt more significant than any grand gesture could have managed. He helped her aunt repair a fence one afternoon, apparently more skilled with practical labor than his title would suggest, and Wren watched him work with his sleeves rolled up, sweat on his brow, looking nothing like the untouchable king she'd once imagined all alpha rulers to be. It was on the 4th evening, sitting together on the low stone wall at the edge of the orchard, that the bond finally settled into something undeniable. They'd been talking about nothing in particular, the strange shape of a cloud, A memory from Wren's childhood about a tree she used to climb before she'd gotten too tall for the lowest branches when Merrick reached over, slowly, and took her hand in his. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. Just fingers closing gently around hers, warm and steady, and the moment his skin touched hers, Wren felt something shift in her chest that she had absolutely no doubt about this time. Warmth, unmistakable, spreading outward from her chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. A sense of rightness she hadn't felt with Callum even in their best moments, not desperate or urgent, just deeply, quietly certain. "You feel it," Merrick said, watching her face carefully. "Yes," Wren breathed. "I feel it. This is different from anything I felt with him. This is," she struggled for words, "this is real, isn't it?" "Actually real. It's real," he confirmed, and the relief in his voice matched the wonder in hers. She leaned into him without deciding to, and his arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all, simply sitting together in the gathering dusk with the bond finally, undeniably alive between them. "I was so afraid," Wren admitted eventually, "that I'd imagined all of this. That I was clinging to your kindness because I was desperate after what Callum did, and none of it was actually as real as it felt. I worried about that too, if I'm honest," Merrick said. "I worried I'd projected something onto a moment of genuine tragedy, that I'd mistaken sympathy for something deeper because the timing felt so significant. But this," he tightened his arm around her slightly. "This isn't sympathy. This isn't projection. I've felt mate bonds described by others my whole life. And none of the descriptions came close to explaining what this actually feels like, until right now." They sat together until the stars came out fully, and when they finally walked back toward the cottage, Wren's aunt took one look at their faces and simply smiled, saying nothing beyond, "There's tea if you want it," before retreating tactfully to give them privacy. That night, lying awake in her small childhood bedroom, Wren thought about everything that had happened in 4 months, the humiliation of the altar, the strange kindness of a stranger who turned out to be a king, the slow accumulation of letters that had somehow become the foundation of something more real than 3 years of assumed certainty ever had been. She thought about Callum too, and found, surprisingly, that the thought no longer carried the sharp sting it once had. She didn't hate him, exactly, she understood, now, that whatever they'd shared had been genuine in its own limited way, just never the deepest thing either of them was capable of. His rejection had been cruel in its execution, careless in its public cruelty, but it hadn't actually been wrong about the fundamental truth underneath it. They weren't meant to be mates, no matter how much she'd once wanted to believe otherwise. The following morning, Merrick asked her to walk with him again, and this time, instead of the quiet orchard, he led her to a small rise overlooking the whole valley, the morning light spreading gold across the fields below. "I know this is fast," he said. 4 months, most of it conducted through letters rather than actual time together. "I know the sensible thing would be to wait longer, to be entirely certain before asking anything more of you." "But," Wren said, sensing where this was heading. "But I've spent my whole reign being sensible," Merrick said, weighing every decision carefully, waiting for absolute certainty before committing to anything. "And I find, standing here with you, that I don't want to be sensible about this. I want to ask you properly, without an altar full of witnesses, without any pretense, would you consider building something permanent with me? Not today, necessarily, not even this month, if you need longer. But eventually, properly." Wren looked out over the valley for a long moment before answering, letting the morning light and the weight of the question settle properly in her chest. "I want to say yes immediately," she admitted. "Every part of the bond in my chest is telling me to say yes right now, without hesitation. But I promised myself, after Callum, that I wouldn't rush into permanent things just because they felt good in the moment. I want to be sure this isn't just relief talking. That I'm choosing you because of who you actually are, not because you happen to be kind to me on the worst day of my life." "That's fair," Merrick said, and there was no disappointment in his voice, only patience. "Take whatever time you need to be certain. I'm not going anywhere. What if I need months? What if I need a full year even to be entirely sure? Then I'll wait a year," he said simply. "I've waited this long already, watching you heal from a distance through letters. A little more time doesn't frighten me, not when I'm as certain as I already am." It was that certainty, more than anything else, that finally settled something anxious in Wren's chest. Callum had never once given her the sense that he'd wait for anything. Their whole relationship had moved at his pace, shaped by his readiness, his timeline, his eventual decision to abandon it all the moment something better appeared. Merrick offering to simply wait, without pressure, without impatience, felt like the clearest evidence yet that whatever this was, it wasn't built on the same foundation. "I don't think I need a full year," she said slowly. "I think I need to see you a few more times, properly, away from letters. I need to know what it's like having you actually present in ordinary life, not just in carefully composed pages sent across 3 valleys." "Then let me visit again," Merrick said, "as often as you'll allow. Let's build the ordinary parts together, and see where they lead." She agreed, and over the following 2 months he visited 4 more times, each visit longer than the last, each one revealing small, ordinary truths about him that letters could never have captured. She learned he was terrible at cooking, burned porridge with impressive consistency, and took the teasing about it with genuine good humor rather than wounded pride. She learned he had a scar along his ribs from a border skirmish years earlier that he still occasionally winced about in cold weather. She learned that beneath the careful, measured king persona was a man who laughed easily once he trusted the company he was in, who asked her aunt detailed questions about herbal remedies with genuine curiosity, who remembered small details about Wren's life that she'd only mentioned once in passing months earlier. Word had, inevitably, begun spreading about the Northern King's frequent visits to a modest southern village, and Wren found herself occasionally fielding curious questions from neighbors who'd caught wind of the rumors. She handled them with more grace than she'd expected of herself, mostly by simply telling the truth that a mate bond had formed under unusual circumstances, and they were taking the time to build something real rather than rushing into a hasty announcement. Callum, she heard eventually through the pack grapevine that still occasionally reached her aunt's cottage, had married his true mate within weeks of the disastrous ceremony, apparently in a much smaller, quieter affair than the elaborate wedding he'd abandoned Wren at. She felt, hearing the news, an almost surprising absence of pain, just a quiet acknowledgement that his path had simply diverged from hers, and that divergence had ultimately led her somewhere far better than she could have imagined on that terrible morning months earlier. It was during Merrick's 5th visit, nearly 7 months after the ceremony that had upended her life, that Wren finally understood with complete certainty that she was ready. They were sitting by the same low stone wall where the bond had first fully settled between them, watching evening fall across the orchard, when Wren finally spoke the thought she'd been carrying for weeks. "I'm ready," she said simply. Merrick turned to look at her, something careful and hopeful in his expression. "Ready for what, exactly?" "For all of it," Wren said. "For whatever comes next. I've spent 7 months making sure this was real, making sure I wasn't just clinging to the first kindness I found after Callum humiliated me, and I'm certain now. I love you. Properly, entirely, without any lingering doubt clouding it." Something in his face transformed at the words relief and joy so raw, it was almost overwhelming to witness in a man normally so composed. "I love you too," he said. "I think I've known it since that very first evening outside the ceremony hall, watching you cry against a stone wall and wanting, more than anything, to somehow fix what had just happened to you." "You couldn't fix it," Wren said, "but you gave me something better than fixing it. You gave me time, and honesty, and the space to figure out what I actually wanted, instead of what I'd assumed I wanted for 3 years. He reached for her hand, the same way he had months earlier, and this time she didn't hesitate at all before leaning into him. I want to ask you something properly, Merrick said, not the vague, patient question from before. I want to ask you to be my mate, formally, permanently, and I want to do it somewhere entirely different from the last time you stood in front of witnesses making promises. Where? Wren asked, already smiling. Here, he said. In this orchard, with just your aunt as witness, if she's willing, and no one else, no grand pack ceremony, no crowd of onlookers who might laugh at the wrong moment, just us, and the people who actually matter. Wren's eyes filled with tears, though this time they were nothing like the ones she'd cried against that stone wall 7 months earlier. Yes, she said. Yes, absolutely yes. Her aunt, when informed of the plan, immediately began fussing about flowers and food, delighted in a way that made both Wren and Merrick laugh at her transparent excitement. The ceremony, when it finally happened 3 weeks later, was nothing like the elaborate affair that had ended so disastrously months earlier. No towering, flowering arch built by pack elders, no rows of watching faces waiting to witness whatever happened next, just the small orchard, a handful of wildflowers Wren had gathered herself that morning, and her aunt standing as the sole witness with tears openly running down her weathered face. I claim you, Merrick said, his voice rough with emotion as he took both her hands in his beneath the orchard trees, as my mate, my equal, the person I intend to build every remaining day of my life alongside. Not because a bond told me to, though it did, and not because circumstance threw us together in a moment of crisis, though it did that too. I claim you because I've spent 7 months coming to know you properly, and every single thing I've learned has only deepened what I already knew that first evening, that you are exactly who I want beside me, for as long as I live. I claim you, Wren said back, her own voice unsteady, as my mate, knowing now what a true bond actually feels like, understanding finally the difference between something that simply exists and something that's chosen, again and again, deliberately, with full knowledge of what it means. You showed me kindness on the worst day of my life without asking anything in return, and you've shown me nothing but patience and honesty every day since. I choose you. Completely, and without any doubt left in my heart. The bond, already strong between them, seemed to settle into something even deeper as the final words left her mouth warm and certain and entirely. Finally home. News of the marriage spread through both the northern territories and the southern valleys within days, and Wren braced herself, initially, for the same kind of gossip and judgment that had followed her after the disastrous ceremony months earlier. Instead, she found something entirely different waiting for her genuine curiosity, mostly kind, occasionally odd, about the woman who'd apparently caught the attention of a king known throughout 3 territories for his careful, measured approach to everything in his life. Her old pack, the one she'd grown up in, sent word eventually to a stiff, formal letter from the pack elder congratulating her on the union, careful in its wording in a way that suggested no small amount of discomfort about how the story reflected on Callum's own poor judgment. Wren read it once, felt a brief flicker of something that might have been vindication, and then simply set it aside, uninterested in dwelling on a chapter of her life that had already closed properly months earlier. Moving to the Northern Territories required more adjustment than Wren had initially anticipated. The palace, unlike anything she'd experienced growing up in a modest pack village, was enormous and formal in ways that occasionally left her feeling adrift among staff who weren't quite sure how to treat a queen who'd arrived from such humble circumstances. "You're allowed to ask questions," Merrick told her gently, during her first week navigating the palace's endless protocols. "You're not expected to already know everything simply because you're married to me now. I certainly didn't know everything about ruling when I first took the throne, whatever anyone might assume looking at me now. It's a lot, Ren admitted. Learning an entirely new set of expectations, on top of learning an entirely new home. Then we'll learn it together, at whatever pace makes sense, he said. There's no rush. I'd rather you actually understand things properly than pretend to know them simply to avoid looking uncertain. Her aunt visited within the first month, delighted by the palace's grandeur but entirely unimpressed by its formality, treating Merrick's advisors with the same blunt directness she'd once used to interrogate his intentions in her own modest kitchen. Ren watched with quiet amusement as several of the palace's more pretentious staff members quickly learned not to underestimate the woman who'd apparently raised the new queen. It was during her aunt's visit that Ren finally received an unexpected letter from Callum himself, of all people, brief and awkwardly worded, apparently attempting some form of belated apology for how he'd handled things months earlier. I never should have told you the way I did, the letter read. You deserved better than what happened at that altar, regardless of what was true underneath it. I hope, wherever you've ended up, that you've found something better than what we had. Ren read it twice, considered several possible responses, and ultimately settled on a short, gracious reply not warm, exactly, but not bitter either, simply acknowledging the apology and confirming that yes, she had, in fact, found something considerably better. Does it bother you? Merrick asked, when she mentioned the exchange, hearing from him at all, even briefly. No, Ren said, and realized, saying it, that it was entirely true. It's strange, actually. A few months ago, even the thought of his name made my chest ache. Now it barely registers as anything beyond a closed chapter. I think that's how I know how completely this has healed, not because I've forgotten what happened, but because it simply doesn't have any power over me anymore. Marek pulled her close, pressing a kiss against her temple. I'm glad, he said simply. You deserve to heal from that properly, not just paper over it with a new relationship. I'm glad this actually gave you the space to do both. The following spring brought news that settled something deeply content into the palace's rhythm. Ren was pregnant. A fact confirmed by the palace physician after weeks of Ren feeling strangely unwell in ways she'd initially dismissed as simple adjustment to her new life. Merrick's reaction, when she told him, was somewhere between overwhelming joy and immediate. Fierce protectiveness that made her laugh despite the hormonal exhaustion already settling into her days. You're not lifting anything heavier than a teacup for the next several months, he informed her, entirely serious, the morning after the physician's confirmation. I'm pregnant, not incapacitated, Ren said, amused. Women manage pregnancies while doing considerably more than sitting still holding teacups. Other women don't have an alpha king who happens to be their mate hovering nearby, capable of doing the lifting himself, he pointed out, and she couldn't entirely argue with the logic, even as she rolled her eyes at his sudden, thorough dedication to her comfort. Her aunt arrived within weeks of hearing the news, immediately taking over what she deemed the important preparations, which mostly consisted of overruling several of the palace's more elaborate suggestions about nursery decoration in favor of simpler, more practical arrangements drawn from her own decades of experience with village births. Kings and their fancy ideas, she muttered, examining an elaborate gold-trimmed crib the palace staff had procured before ultimately vetoing it entirely. The child needs somewhere safe to sleep, not somewhere to be photographed. Merrick, to his credit, deferred to her judgment on most matters without complaint, apparently having learned quickly during her earlier visit that arguing with Ren's aunt rarely ended favorably for anyone involved. The pregnancy passed with the ordinary discomforts every expecting mother faced, made easier by Merrick's constant, occasionally overbearing attentiveness and Ren's aunt's steady, practical presence throughout. There were difficult days, certainly exhaustion, nausea in the early months, the the particular vulnerability of carrying a child while adjusting to an entirely new role as queen, but underneath all of it ran a current of contentment Wren had never fully experienced during her years with Callum, even in their best moments. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," she admitted to Merrick one evening, 7 months into the pregnancy, both of them sitting together in the quiet of their private chambers. Not with the pregnancy specifically, just with all of it. "It's been so good, for so long now, that some part of me keeps bracing for the moment it stops being this easy." "I understand that fear," Marek said, pulling her gently against his side. "I think, after what happened with Callum, it makes sense that trust doesn't come easily, even now, even this far into everything we've built together." "Does it bother you that I still occasionally brace for disaster, even after everything?" "No," he said simply. "I think healing isn't a single moment where all the old fear disappears completely. I think it's more like this small moments of bracing that grow further apart over time, until eventually they barely register at all. You're allowed to still be healing, even while also being completely happy." She turned to look at him properly, something warm and grateful spreading through her chest. "How do you always know exactly the right thing to say?" "I don't, usually," he admitted, with a small, self-deprecating smile. "I burn porridge with startling consistency. Remember, I think I've simply had a great deal of practice this past year, learning what you actually need to hear versus what might sound comforting but ring hollow." Their daughter arrived on a bright morning in early summer, announced to the entire palace by the particular chaos of servants rushing between rooms, the palace physician's calm, practiced instructions cutting through Wren's exhausted, determined focus, and Merrick's hand gripped tightly in hers throughout the entire ordeal, his usual composed demeanor entirely abandoned in favor of raw, unguarded worry that softened the moment their daughter's first cry filled the room. "She's perfect," Merrick breathed, staring down at the small, wrapped bundle with an expression Wren had never seen on him before, not the careful king, not even the patient, devoted mate she'd come to know over the past year, but something rawer and more overwhelmed than either of those roles allowed. "She has your nose," Wren said, exhausted but grinning, watching him hold their daughter with the same careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. "I hope she has your patience," Merrick said. "Mine has always been more limited than people assume." They named her Elian, after Wren's grandmother, and her aunt wept openly holding the baby for the first time, declaring her the most beautiful child born in 3 generations of their family, a claim that went entirely uncontested by anyone present. The following weeks settled into the particular exhausted contentment of new parenthood, punctuated by sleepless nights and the constant, overwhelming tenderness of watching Merrick, a man once known throughout 3 territories for his ruthless efficiency in border disputes, dissolve completely into besotted devotion the moment their daughter so much as stirred in her crib. It was nearly 2 years, almost to the day, from the disastrous ceremony that had once seemed like the end of everything Wren had ever wanted, that she found herself standing in the same orchard where she and Merrick had first properly claimed each other, watching their daughter take her first unsteady steps across the grass while her aunt clapped and cheered from a nearby bench. "Do you ever think about that day?" Merrick asked, coming to stand beside her, his arm settling naturally around her waist. "The ceremony, I mean. What might have happened if I hadn't stayed to watch it, if I'd left the summit a day earlier like I'd originally planned?" Wren considered the question seriously, watching Elin stumble happily toward her great-aunt's outstretched arms. "I used to think about it more," she admitted. "In the early months, especially wondering what would have happened if you hadn't been there, if Callum's cruelty had simply been the end of the story instead of the beginning of a different one. And now? Now I mostly think about how strange it is that the worst day of my life turned out to be the day everything actually good started," Wren said, Not because the humiliation itself was somehow secretly good, it wasn't, and I'd never wish that moment on anyone. But because without it, I never would have been standing at the back of that crowd at all, never would have caught your attention the way I apparently did. You would have found your way to something good eventually, Merrick said. I believe that, but I'm grateful, selfishly, that it happened to be me who was there to watch it happen, and grateful beyond words that you were willing to trust something built from such a difficult beginning. Elin, having successfully navigated her wobbling journey to her great-aunt's lap, let out a delighted shriek of laughter that carried across the whole orchard. And Wren felt the same warm certainty settle through her chest that had first taken root on this exact spot. Nearly 2 years earlier, not the desperate hope she'd once mistaken for love, but something steadier, chosen deliberately again and again, exactly the way it was meant to be.